Evelyn Harper did not scream when her father grabbed her wrist and dragged her out onto the porch. She had learned long ago that screaming changed nothing in this house. She stood in the Arizona dust. Her dress wrinkled, her jaw set tight, her eyes dry as the cracked earth beneath her boots, while her father turned to the man on horseback and said the words she had always feared he would say out loud. "Take the girl," Walter Harper said. "She's worth more than 6 head of cattle any day of the week." If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Evelyn's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. We love seeing how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Ezekiel Callahan had ridden out that morning with no intention of becoming anyone's hero. He had 2 children in the wagon behind him, a list of debts owed to him by 6 men across Maricopa County, and exactly enough patience left in his body for one uncomplicated transaction: 6 head of cattle. That was what Walter Harper owed him. 6 cattle and a handshake, and Ezekiel would turn that wagon around and be home before supper. Samuel, his boy of 14, sat up straight on the wagon bench beside him, already trying to look older than he was. Daisy, who had just turned 9, sat in the back with her knees pulled to her chest, humming something low and tuneless the way she always did when the road got long. Ezekiel had brought them because he had nowhere else to leave them, and because Samuel needed to start learning how business was conducted between men. He had not anticipated needing to explain to either of his children what he was about to witness. The Harper farm sat low in a dry valley, the kind of place that looked like it had given up trying a long time ago. The fence posts leaned. The barn door hung off one hinge. The garden had gone to dust sometime in the last several years, and nobody had bothered to replant it. Ezekiel pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard and waited, because that was the proper way to arrive at another man's property. Walter Harper came out of the house already talking. "Callahan," he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Wasn't expecting you till the end of the month." "It is the end of the month," Ezekiel said. Harper's eyes shifted sideways the way a man's eyes shift when he is arranging a story in his head. "Well, now see, that's where things get a little complicated." Ezekiel did not respond. He had learned years ago that silence was the most efficient way to let a man talk himself into honesty. Harper rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the barn, then at the ground, then at Ezekiel. "I ain't got the cattle," he said. "You sold them. I had debts of my own." "You had debts of your own," Ezekiel repeated slowly. "And you settled them with cattle that belonged to me. I was going to square it up. I swear to you, Callahan, I had every intention." "Walter." Ezekiel's voice was quiet. It was always quiet. That was what made men stop talking when he used it. "What are you offering me in place of those animals?" It was the wrong question to ask. He understood that the moment Harper's face shifted, the nervousness draining out of it, replaced by something else. Something that looked almost like relief, as if he had been waiting for this exact opening, and was grateful it had finally arrived. Harper turned toward the house and called out, "Evelyn, get out here!" The girl who appeared in the doorway was perhaps 20 years old, though the look in her eyes was older than that. She had dark hair pinned back from a face that was carefully blank, the face of someone who had practiced making herself unreadable. She was wiping her hands on a rag, and she stopped when she saw Ezekiel on the wagon, stopped and looked at her father, and something in her expression tightened. "What is it?" she said. "Come on down here," Harper said. "Mr. Callahan's got business." She came down the porch steps slowly, each step deliberate, and she stood in the yard beside her father, with her arms at her sides and her chin level. She did not look at Ezekiel again. She looked at her father, and the look she gave him was not one of fear. It was something colder than fear. It was the look of a person who had already guessed what was coming, and had decided exactly how she intended to meet it. "This here's my daughter Evelyn," Harper said. "She's able-bodied, she can cook, she can keep a house, she's got no bad habits, and she ain't spoken for." He paused. "I reckon she's worth a fair sight more than 6 head of cattle." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Samuel made a small sound beside Ezekiel on the bench. Daisy had stopped humming. Ezekiel did not move, did not speak, did not take his eyes off Walter Harper's face. It was Evelyn who broke the silence. "No," she said. Just the one word. Clear and flat and final. Harper turned to look at her. "Evelyn?" "No," she said again. "I am not property, Papa. I am not a thing you can trade." "You'll do as I say," Harper said, and his voice had dropped into something harder. "You'll do as I say, or so help me." "So help you what?" She turned to face him fully now, and the blankness was gone from her face. What replaced it was not anger. Not yet. It was something more dangerous than anger. It was clarity. "What else is there left?" "You already sold the horses. You sold the grain that was supposed to last us through winter. You sold Mama's silver the week after we buried her, and you told me it was to pay for the funeral. But I know better than that now, Papa. I know exactly where that money went." Her voice did not tremble. "I am the last thing you have left, and you are standing here in the dirt trying to trade me to a stranger for 6 cattle you already spent. You will not do this. I will not allow it." Harper's hand moved before Ezekiel had fully registered that it was going to move. The slap was open-handed fast, the crack of it sharp in the dry air. Evelyn's head snapped to the side. She did not fall. She stood perfectly still for one long moment, with her face turned away, and then she straightened, and she brought her hand up to her cheek, and she looked at her father with an expression that was beyond hatred, beyond sorrow. It was the expression of a person looking at something they are finished with. Ezekiel was off the wagon. He was not entirely sure when he had made the decision to move. It had not felt like a decision. It had felt like gravity. He was simply on the ground, and then he was standing between Walter Harper and his daughter, and Harper took one look at him and stepped back. "Now hold on," Harper said. "This is a family matter, Callahan. You got no right to—" "Step back," Ezekiel said. The words were quiet. They were always quiet. But there was something in the way he said them that made Harper step back. Ezekiel did not turn around. He spoke to the girl behind him without looking at her. "Are you hurt, miss?" A pause. "No," she said. Her voice was steady. "Can you walk?" Another pause shorter. "Yes." "Then walk to the other side of my wagon and wait there, please." He heard her footsteps in the dirt. He heard Samuel scramble down from the bench. He heard Daisy's voice, very small, saying something he couldn't make out, and then Evelyn's voice, low and controlled, answering her. Harper was staring at him. "You can't just, she belongs here. She's my daughter." "She's a grown woman," Ezekiel said, "and you just struck her in front of witnesses." He let that sit for a moment. "Now, we are going to talk about my cattle." "I told you I ain't got—" "I know you ain't got the cattle, Walter. So here is what's going to happen." Ezekiel reached into the breast pocket of his coat and removed a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and held it out. "This is a promissory note. You're going to sign it. It acknowledges that you owe me 6 head of cattle, or the fair market equivalent in currency, to be paid no later than the 1st day of October. I will have my lawyer register it at the courthouse in Maricopa." He kept his arm extended, the paper steady in his hand. "That is what is going to happen today. That is the only thing that is going to happen today." Harper looked at the paper. He looked at Ezekiel. He was calculating the way men like Harper always calculated, measuring what he had against what he stood to lose. "And the girl?" "The girl," Ezekiel said, "is going to make her own decision about where she goes. That decision is hers. It has nothing to do with your debt, and nothing to do with me." He kept his eyes level on Harper's face. "Sign the paper, Walter." Harper signed it. He signed it because he had no other choice, and because something in Ezekiel Callahan's stillness communicated very clearly that there were no other available options. He signed it with a hand that wasn't quite steady, and he handed it back without meeting Ezekiel's eyes. Ezekiel folded the paper and returned it to his pocket. He turned and walked back to the wagon. Evelyn was standing on the far side of it, the way he'd asked, with Daisy pressed against her side, and Samuel standing a few feet away, pretending not to stare. She had one arm around Daisy's shoulders, the hand on the girl's shoulder, gentle and automatic, the way some people are gentle without thinking about it. Her cheek was red, where Harper had struck her. She was looking at Ezekiel with an expression he couldn't quite name. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "He was fixing to hit you again," Ezekiel said. "I know." A pause. "I meant the note. You could have just left." "I could have," he agreed. He looked at her steadily. "Where are you going to go, Miss?" She didn't answer right away. She looked past him at the house, at the broken fence, at the dying garden. Her arm tightened briefly around Daisy's shoulders, then released. "I don't know," she said finally. "Somewhere that isn't here." Ezekiel considered her. He was not an impulsive man. He had not been impulsive since the year after his wife Margaret died, when he had done several things that fell into that category and regretted all of them. He thought before he acted, and he was thinking now clearly and carefully, turning the situation over in his mind, the way he'd turn a stone over in his hand. The woman in front of him had no money, no horse, no resources he could identify, and a father. She was clearly finished with, standing 30 yards away, watching them with his arms crossed. It was late morning in the Arizona summer. The nearest town with a boarding house was 16 miles east. "I've got a ranch," Ezekiel said. "I've got more work than I've got hands. I can offer you a fair wage, your own sleeping quarters separate from the house, and a written contract that spells out exactly what's owed to you and when." He paused. "That's the offer, miss. It's a working arrangement, nothing more. You'd be employed, not obligated. You can leave whenever you choose." She looked at him for a long time. He had the sense that she was reading him carefully, the way a person reads a document they've been told might be fraudulent, looking for the clause that changes everything. He held still under the examination. He had nothing to hide, and no patience for pretending otherwise. "You'd put it in writing," she said. "I just said I would." "And your children are there." "Obviously," he said. "You just met 2 of them." Daisy, still pressed against Evelyn's side, looked up at her with enormous, patient eyes. Samuel had given up pretending not to watch and was watching openly now. Something in Evelyn's face shifted. Not softened exactly. It was more like a door that had been braced shut from the inside, slowly, carefully opened an inch. "All right," she said. "All right," Ezekiel said. "Get whatever you need from the house." "There isn't anything in that house I need," she said. He looked at her. "Nothing." She thought for a moment, then turned and walked back up the porch steps and went inside. She was back in less than 4 minutes, carrying a canvas bag that wasn't very full and a small wooden box that she held against her chest with both arms. She didn't look at her father, who was still standing in the yard. Harper opened his mouth. "Evelyn, don't," she said without stopping, without turning her head. She climbed up into the back of the wagon beside Daisy, set the canvas bag down, kept the wooden box in her lap, and sat. She looked straight ahead. Harper took 2 steps toward the wagon. "I'm your father," he said. "You can't just—" "I can," she said. "I am." Ezekiel climbed back up onto the bench. He took the reins. He clicked his tongue at the horses, and the wagon rolled forward, and Walter Harper stood in his ruined yard and watched them go, and nobody on that wagon looked back at him. They rode in silence for a long while. The desert opened up around them, wide and pale and indifferent. The sun pressed down. Samuel sat stiffly beside Ezekiel, conducting some internal debate with himself that was visible in the set of his jaw. Daisy had scooted close to Evelyn and was looking at the wooden box with frank and uninhibited curiosity. "What's in there?" Daisy asked. "Daisy," Ezekiel said. "It's fine," Evelyn said. She looked down at Daisy. "Letters," she said. "My mother's letters. She wrote to her sister back in Georgia every month for 20 years. She paused. "My aunt sent them back to me after Mama died. My father didn't know she'd done it." Daisy considered this with the gravity of a 9-year-old confronting something that is just slightly beyond her full comprehension, but that she intends to understand eventually. "Is that why you kept them separate?" she asked. "So he couldn't sell them too?" The sound that came out of Evelyn was not quite a laugh. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly why. Samuel broke his silence about 4 miles from the Harper place. He did it sideways, the way 15-year-old boys do, without looking at the person he was speaking to. "For what it's worth," he said, in a voice that was still settling into its lower register, "I think what my father did back there was the right thing." "Samuel," Ezekiel said, "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying. Let Miss Harper sit quiet if she wants to." "I don't mind," Evelyn said. She was looking at the back of Samuel's head. "Thank you," she said. "For what it's worth, I think so too." Samuel nodded, still not quite looking at her, and returned to his internal debate. The Callahan Ranch was 3 miles off the main road, set back into a broad, flat stretch of land that had been cultivated carefully over many years into something that looked unlike the Harper place, like it intended to survive. The house was solid and plain. The barn was in good repair. There was a small structure set apart from the main house, a bunkhouse that was currently unoccupied, and it was to this building that Ezekiel led Evelyn first. It was modest. A cot, a washstand, a window that looked out toward the west. But the floor was swept clean, and the cot had a quilt on it, and the window closed properly against the wind. "It ain't much," Ezekiel said. "It's mine?" she asked. "While you're here and working, yes." She set the canvas bag on the cot and held the wooden box in both hands and looked around the room. Her expression was still controlled, still carefully contained, but something behind her eyes had gone very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with composure. "It's fine," she said. Her voice was slightly different than it had been. "It's more than fine." He left her there and went to his desk where he drafted the contract in plain language, the way his father had taught him to write any agreement, clearly, specifically, with no room for misunderstanding. He listed her duties, her wage, her hours, her right to leave without penalty at any time and for any reason, and the terms under which her employment could be ended for cause. When he knocked on the bunkhouse door an hour later and handed her the document, she read every word of it. She read it twice. "You wrote this yourself," she said. "I did." "You're not a lawyer." "No, ma'am. But you know enough to write something like this." "My father believed a man should know enough law to protect what's his," he said, "and to protect other people from what they don't know." She looked at him over the top of the paper. The afternoon light was falling through the window and across her face, and for the first time since he'd seen her on that porch, some of the rigid control in her features had loosened just slightly, just enough. She looked in that moment like someone who was beginning to let herself believe that a thing was real. "I'd like to make one change," she said. "What change?" "Here." She pointed to the section about her duties. "You've listed cooking and housekeeping. I can do those things. But I can also read, and I can write, and I can do figures." She looked up at him. "I noticed on the ride over that your Samuel is clever, but he's got gaps in his schooling. And Daisy can't read yet at all." Ezekiel looked at her. "You want to teach them?" "I want it in the contract," she said. "As part of my duties, not because I'm asked to do it as a favor, because it's work, and work deserves to be recognized as such." He was quiet for a moment. "Fair enough," he said. She handed the document back to him, and he made the addition, and she signed it, and he signed it, and she folded her copy and placed it carefully inside the wooden box with her mother's letters, and then she closed the lid. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Ezekiel. Ezekiel." She said it carefully, trying the sound of it. "Why did you stop him back at the farm? You didn't have to. It wasn't your business." He thought about it. He was the kind of man who thought before answering questions like that, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he believed an answer worth giving deserved to be given right. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Margaret. She was the most capable woman I have ever known in my life, and she would have walked into that yard and done the same thing I did, except she'd have done it with less patience and better words." He paused. "I reckon I try to do things the way she would have wanted them done. It doesn't always work, but I try." Evelyn looked at him for a long, still moment. Then she said, "She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was," he said. "She really was. He left her to settle in and went to help Samuel with the evening feeding and did not look back at the bunkhouse. But when he passed by on his way into the house an hour later, the window was lit from inside with the warm light of the lamp, and through the glass he could see Evelyn sitting on the edge of the cot with one of her mother's letters open in her hands, reading in the quiet, in a room that was hers, in a place that no one had sold her to. He walked past and did not disturb her. In the morning, the real work would begin. And somewhere in Maricopa County, Silas Boone, who had his own ideas about Evelyn Harper and what she was worth, was already making plans. She was up before sunrise. Ezekiel knew this because he was always up before sunrise himself. And when he stepped out of the house in the gray quarter light of early morning, Evelyn Harper was already in the yard, drawing water from the well, with the steady, practiced rhythm of someone who had been doing hard work since before she was old enough to complain about it. She had her sleeves rolled to the elbows. She did not look up when he came out. "You don't start until I ring the bell," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not on the clock yet." She set the bucket down and looked at him. "I don't sleep well in new places. I'd rather be doing something useful than lying on a cot staring at the ceiling." He considered that. "Fair enough," he said, and went to start the fire. By the time Daisy wandered into the kitchen, still trailing her blanket and squinting against the light, Evelyn had biscuits in the oven and coffee on the stove, and Samuel had come in from the barn, smelling of horses and hay, and the four of them sat around the table together, in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that forms naturally when people are simply occupying the same space without requiring anything of each other. It was, Ezekiel thought, a surprisingly decent way to start a morning. "You said you could teach figures," Samuel said to Evelyn, not looking up from his plate. "I did say that." "How far?" She looked at him. "How far do you know?" "I can do multiplication and division. Long division." A pause. "Most of the time. I can teach you fractions, decimals, basic accounting principles, and how to read a legal land survey." She said it the same way she said everything plainly without inflation. "Your father keeps ledgers. I assume you'll be expected to manage them someday." Samuel looked up at that. He looked at his father. "She can teach me accounting." "Apparently," Ezekiel said. "That's—" Samuel stopped himself, rearranged whatever he had been about to say into something more restrained. "That would be useful," he said carefully. Daisy, who had been following this conversation with her chin in her hand, said, "I want to learn to read." "I know," Evelyn said. "We'll start after breakfast." Daisy sat up straight so fast she nearly knocked over her milk. That was how the first morning went. And the second. And by the third day, the rhythm of the ranch had folded Evelyn into it, as though she had always been there. Not because anyone had decided to accept her, but because she was simply too capable and too matter-of-fact to be ignored. She fixed what was broken without being asked. She organized the kitchen shelving in a way that made finding things take half the time. She sat with Daisy every afternoon, and by the end of the first week, the girl could read 6 words she hadn't known before. She worked without performing the work, without looking around to see if anyone had noticed, and it was precisely that quality that made everyone notice. Samuel noticed. He started arriving at the table 5 minutes early. He started asking questions that went beyond the ledger pages she set in front of him. Questions about the law, about contracts, about how a man protected what he owned. Ezekiel noticed his son noticing and said nothing about it because there was nothing wrong with a boy learning that competence had no fixed address. Ezekiel noticed too. He noticed in the specific way of a man who is trying very hard not to notice, which is to say he noticed constantly and with great inconvenience to himself. He noticed that she never asked for help and never refused it when it was offered. He noticed that she was always the last one to sit down and the first one to stand up. He noticed that she talked to his children like they were people worth talking to, not like they were children to be managed. And he noticed what that meant to both of them in ways they didn't have words for yet. On the 4th evening, he came in from the field to find her sitting at his desk with his ledger open in front of her. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up without flinching. "You've been overcharged for feed," she said. 3 times in the last 8 months by the same supplier. The error is consistent enough that it isn't an error. He walked to the desk and looked at the column she was pointing to. He looked at the numbers. He sat down slowly in the chair across from her. "How did you catch that? I added it differently than you did." She turned the ledger so he could see. "You were adding by transaction. I added by month and then cross-referenced the rate per hundredweight against the market price listed in the County Agricultural Bulletin, which you've been keeping in the bottom drawer." She paused. "You've paid out nearly $40 extra over the past year." $40 was not a small amount. $40 was a month's worth of wages for a hired hand. $40 was the kind of money that accumulated over time, became the difference between a ranch that survived a dry year and one that didn't. Ezekiel looked at her across the desk. "You found all of this in one evening." "I wasn't tired," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Evelyn," he said, "where did you learn to do this?" Something shifted in her face. Not much, just a degree or two, the way a compass needle shifts when it finds true north. "My mother," she said. "She kept the household accounts. My father didn't know or didn't care to know. She taught me that numbers don't lie, and that if you know how to read them correctly, they tell you exactly what a person is doing when they think no one is watching." She closed the ledger carefully. She used to say that the ledger is the most honest thing in any household. She was right, Ezekiel said. She was usually right. The shift in her face settled into something quieter. "I should have listened to her more when I had the chance." He didn't ask her what she meant by that. He had learned already that Evelyn Harper gave you the information she was ready to give, and held back the rest until she was ready to give that too, and that pushing her was the fastest way to get nothing at all. He simply said, "I'll be speaking to that supplier first thing tomorrow." And she nodded and handed him the ledger and went to help Daisy with the supper dishes. It was 3 days after that when Silas Boone arrived. He came in a carriage, which was the first thing Ezekiel noted, because men who came to working ranches in carriages were men who wanted you to know they had enough money not to ride a horse. The carriage was well maintained, and the horses were expensive, and the man who stepped down from it wore a suit that had no business being this far from a city. He was somewhere around 50, with the broad, satisfied look of a man who had spent most of his life being told yes. He looked at Ezekiel. Then he looked past him at the yard at the bunkhouse at Evelyn, who had come out of the barn leading the work mule and had stopped when she saw the carriage. Boone smiled. It was the smile of a man completing a calculation. "Callahan," he said, "I heard you'd taken on some new help." "Word travels fast," Ezekiel said. "It always does out here." Boone settled his hat on his head and started walking toward Evelyn without having been invited to. "Miss Harper, it's good to see you've found shelter." He said it the way a man says something that means the opposite of what the words suggest. Evelyn did not move. She stood with the mule's lead rope in her hand and watched him come. "Mr. Boone," she said. Her voice was level. "I didn't expect to see you here. I've been asking after you since I heard you'd left your father's place," Boone said. He stopped a few feet from her. "Your father and I have had some conversations about your situation." "My situation," she repeated. "There's a matter of a contract," Boone said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "Your father signed an agreement on your behalf some months back. I've been patient about it on account of your mother's passing and the difficulties your family's been through. But the terms are what they are, and I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what's owed." Evelyn looked at the document in his hand. She did not reach for it. "What contract?" she said. "A betrothal agreement," Boone said. "Executed in March of this year, witnessed and signed by your father as your legal guardian." He held it out. "You were listed as the party of the second part." "I never signed anything," she said. "You didn't need to," Boone said with the patient tone of a man explaining something simple to someone he considers slow. "Your father has legal authority to enter into agreements on your behalf. That's the law." He paused. "That's always been the law," There was a silence in the yard that had a particular kind of texture to it, taut like a rope pulled tight between two anchor points. Ezekiel had moved without entirely deciding to, so that he was standing slightly to Evelyn's right, close enough to be present far enough to let her speak. And she spoke. "Give me that," she said, and took the document from Boone's hand before he could decide whether to let her have it. She unfolded it. She read it. She read the whole thing standing there in the yard with the mule shifting weight beside her, and Boone watching her with that settled, confident expression. She read it the way she read everything completely, without rushing, without performing the reading for anyone's benefit. And when she was finished, she folded it in half along the original crease and held it at her side and looked at Silas Boone. "This was written in March," she said. "My mother died in February." "Yes," Boone said. "My father signed this 6 weeks after he buried his wife." "I understand it was a difficult time for your family." Boone's tone did not change. "That doesn't affect the legal validity of the agreement. You came to a grieving man 6 weeks after he buried his wife." Evelyn said slowly, "And you got him to sign away his daughter." "I came to a man who had significant debts and limited options," Boone said. "I offered him a fair arrangement." "You offered yourself a 20-year-old woman," she said, "from a man who was barely in his right mind with grief and whatever else he was drinking at the time. And you called it a fair arrangement." Boone's expression did not change. That was the most alarming thing about him, that nothing she said produced any visible effect on that broad, satisfied face. "Miss Harper," he said, "I suggest you think carefully about your position here. You are employed by Mr. Callahan on a temporary basis. You have no money, no property of your own, and no family able or willing to support you. The agreement your father signed entitles you to a home financial security and a respectable position in this county." He paused. "I am offering you something most women in your circumstances would be grateful for." "You are offering me a cage with nicer walls," she said. The silence after that was absolute. Then Ezekiel said, "Mr. Boone, I'll need you to direct all further communication on this matter to my attorney, Mr. Aldous Hale, whose office is in Maricopa." His voice was as always quiet, completely dangerously quiet. "If you have a legal claim, you can present it to him, and he will respond accordingly. If you do not have a legal claim, then this conversation is finished." Boone looked at him. The calculation in his eyes was visible, brief, and ultimately concluded in a direction that kept him standing where he was, rather than taking a step forward. "I have every confidence in the legal claim," Boone said. "I simply hoped we could resolve this civilly. You came to a woman's place of employment without prior arrangement and presented her with a document she'd never seen," Ezekiel said. "That's not civil, Mr. Boone. That's a tactic." Boone smiled again, and this smile was different from the first one. Thinner, cooler, the smile of a man who has revised his initial assessment of a situation and found it more complicated than he expected. "All right," he said. "Hale's office. I know where it is." He turned and walked back toward his carriage, then stopped and looked back. "Miss Harper," he said, "I want you to understand something. This doesn't have to be unpleasant. I'm a reasonable man." "So I've heard," she said. He got into the carriage, and it rolled away down the drive. And when it turned onto the road and disappeared behind the tree line, Evelyn let out a long, slow breath. Her hand was clenched around the folded document so tightly that the paper had creased along new lines. Ezekiel turned to look at her. "Can I see it?" She held it out without speaking. He read it. He read it twice, because the first time he was looking at the language, and the second time he was looking at the structure, at the specific clauses, at the witnessing signatures, at the date of execution, and the nature of the obligations it described. When he was finished, he handed it back. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that in him meant he was thinking hard and fast. "This was drafted by someone who knows contract law," he said. "I know," she said. "I could tell." "That means Boone didn't write it himself. He had someone write it for him. Someone who understood exactly how to make it difficult to challenge." She looked at him. "Can it be challenged?" "I don't know," he said. "Not yet." He paused. "Aldous Hale is a real person. He's the attorney I use. He's sharp and he doesn't like men like Boone on a philosophical level, which helps." He looked at her steadily. "But Evelyn, I need you to tell me something truthfully." "All right," she said. "Did you know about this contract before today?" She held his gaze without flinching. "No," she said. "I knew my father was afraid of Boone. I knew Boone had come around the farm a few times in the spring. I knew my father owed him money. I did not know he had signed anything with my name in it." Her voice was flat and certain. "I would have burned it if I had known." He believed her. He believed her because she had not rushed. The answer had not softened it, had not looked away. He believed her the way you believe a person who has already shown you they don't have the patience for dishonesty. "All right," he said. "We'll go to Hale the day after tomorrow. I've got a delivery in the morning I can't move but the day after." "I can pay for the legal fees," she said immediately. "With what?" She opened her mouth, closed it. The expression on her face was the expression of a woman who has just run up against the specific practical wall of having no resources and who resents it with every fiber of her being. "I'll owe you," she said. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I will owe you," she said again, with a firmness that closed the subject entirely. "Keep a record of it. I want it written down." He looked at her. He thought not for the first time that she was the most thoroughly unmanageable person he had encountered in recent memory, and that this quality, which should have been exhausting, was instead something he found he had no desire to argue with. "Fine," he said. "I'll write it down." That night he sat at his desk a long time after the house had gone quiet. He had the Boone document in front of him, and beside it the county land records he had pulled from his files because he had remembered something Boone had said about property, about debts, and he had wanted to check something. He checked it, and what he found changed everything. He thought he understood about why Silas Boone wanted Evelyn Harper badly enough to get a contract signed 6 weeks after her mother was in the ground. It was not about Evelyn at all. It had never been about Evelyn. The Harper farm sat on 40 acres that bordered the proposed route of the Southern Arizona rail line. The same rail line that 3 land speculators, Boone among them, had been quietly buying up corridor properties for the past 18 months. A married Evelyn Harper would transfer her inherited claim on those 40 acres, a claim she didn't even know she held directly and legally into Boone's hands. Ezekiel sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about what kind of man looks at a grieving widower and a 20-year-old girl and sees 40 acres and a railroad. And then he thought about what he was going to do about it. He told her the next morning. He waited until Samuel had taken Daisy out to the chicken coop and the kitchen was quiet, and then he set the land records on the table in front of Evelyn and said, "I need you to look at something." She looked. She was a fast reader, he had already established that, and she moved through the documents with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything, her finger tracking along the survey lines, her eyes moving between the property boundaries and the railway corridor notation he had marked in pencil the night before. She read without speaking for 4 minutes. Then she set the papers down and sat very still. "My mother's 40 acres, she said. "Your mother's 40 acres, he confirmed. "Not your father's. The land was deeded to your mother by her father in 1861 before she married Harper. Under Arizona territorial law, property held by a wife in her own name prior to marriage is retained separately. When your mother died without a will, the claim passed to you as her only surviving child." He paused. "Not to your father." Evelyn looked at the land record for a moment longer. "My father doesn't know this." "Almost certainly not. Harper doesn't strike me as a man who reads deed records." "But Boone does," she said. "Boone does," Ezekiel said. "Or someone working for him does. The railway corridor was filed with the territorial office last November. Boone started approaching your father in December." He watched her face as she worked through the sequence of it. "The betrothal contract was drawn up in March, 6 weeks after your mother died, because that's when the inheritance transferred to you, which is also when Boone needed the contract to name you specifically as the party of the second part. A married woman's property passes to her husband." He let that sit. "He wasn't buying a wife. He was buying 40 acres of rail corridor land. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a person absorbing something that reorders everything they thought they understood. Evelyn's hands were flat on the table. She was not looking at him anymore. She was looking at some middle distance that was not the kitchen wall, the kind of looking that is actually thinking. "All those visits," she said quietly. "After Mama died. He came to the farm 4 or 5 times. He'd bring things food once, which I thought was decent of him." She stopped. "He was measuring the land." "Yes." "He was sitting at our table eating our food and measuring the land." "Yes." She pushed back from the table and stood up and walked to the window and stood there with her back to him. He did not rush her. He had learned already that rushing Evelyn Harper was a project with no successful outcomes. "My mother planted that 40 acres, she said. "She planted it herself when she was 19 years old. She planted apple trees that took 11 years to start producing, and she told me she planted them knowing she'd be old before she ever saw them full grown. But she planted them anyway because she said some things you do for the people who come after you." She was quiet for a moment. "She planted them for me." Ezekiel said nothing. "He is not getting that land," she said. Her voice was not raised. It was something quieter than raised and considerably more certain. She turned from the window and looked at him. "What does Hale say we can do?" "We're seeing Hale tomorrow," he said. "But I've already thought through the legal argument, and I think there's a strong challenge on 2 grounds. First, a betrothal contract executed without the named party's knowledge or consent is on very shaky legal footing. Second, your father had no authority to include property that was not legally his in any agreement, and if Boone's lawyers did their job properly, they knew that, which means the contract may have been drawn up in bad faith. Can we prove bad faith? That's what Hale is for." She looked at him steadily. "And if Hale says no, if he says the contract holds—" Ezekiel met her eyes. "Then we find another angle," he said. "I am not in the habit of running out of angles." Something in her face shifted just slightly. It was not a smile. Evelyn Harper's smiles were rare and tended to arrive sideways like light through a half-open door, but it was adjacent to one. "No," she said. "I don't imagine you are." Samuel came back in from the coop then, with Daisy behind him. Both of them loudly debating whether the brown hen or the spotted hen had produced more eggs that week, and the conversation closed and the morning moved forward. That night, something woke Ezekiel at 3 o'clock. He was not sure what it was, a sound, or the absence of a sound, or some older animal instinct that operated below the level of conscious awareness. He sat up in the dark. The house was quiet. He listened. Then he smelled it. He was out of bed and through the door before the thought had fully formed, because the smell was smoke, and there was only one thing in the yard that could be burning that would matter this much. The barn was lit from the inside, orange light pressing through the gaps in the siding, and the horses, he had 4 working horses in the near stalls, were screaming. He shouted for Samuel and ran. He got 2 horses out before the smoke drove him back. He could hear Clara, the mare he had owned for 11 years, the horse that had been Margaret's before she was his, screaming somewhere in the back stall, and the smoke was so thick by then that he could not see past his own hands, and he had to get out. He had to get out, and he came out coughing and desperate, and the barn was going fast now, the dry timber taking the fire, the way drought-starved wood takes anything. And Evelyn went in. He saw her go. He shouted her name, and she either did not hear him or did not care, because she had a wet cloth over her face and her arm up against the smoke, and she went in at the side door. He had come out of the one that was not yet fully engulfed, and she disappeared into the orange dark. Samuel grabbed his arm. "Pa! Get the water line. Wake the neighbors if you can. Go." He pushed his son toward the pump and turned back to the barn door. And he could hear nothing now over the roar of the fire and the wind and his own heartbeat. And he stood there in what was the longest minute of his recent life, and he thought about all the things a man thinks about when someone has walked into a burning building on his behalf. And then Evelyn came out. She came out leading Clara by the halter, the mare wild-eyed and pulling against her, and Evelyn's dress was singed at the hem, and there was ash in her hair, and she was coughing hard enough to bend her at the waist. But she was upright, and Clara was upright, and behind her. Behind her impossibly was Daisy, who had apparently followed Evelyn into the barn because she had heard Clara screaming and could not bear it, and Evelyn had found her in the smoke and gotten her out with one hand on the mare and one hand on the child, and she had not left either one behind. Ezekiel crossed the yard in 4 strides. He grabbed Daisy first because that was instinct, that was the place where everything else went silent, and there was only his daughter. And he held her against him with both arms. And she was coughing, and her eyes were streaming, and she was saying over and over, "I'm all right, Papa. I'm all right. I'm all right." He looked at Evelyn over the top of his daughter's head. She was still holding Clara's halter. She had her other hand braced on her knee, bent forward, coughing. She looked up at him, and her eyes were red from the smoke, and she said in a wrecked and ragged voice, "Your horse is fine. Your daughter is fine." She coughed again. "The east wall is gone." "I can see that," he said. "I heard her," Daisy said into his shoulder. "Clara was crying, and I couldn't just—" "I know," he said. "I know." Samuel came back at a run with 2 neighbors from the adjoining property behind him, and they worked through what was left of the night on the fire, and by the time the sky went gray in the east, the barn was a ruin, but the house was standing, and the horses were alive, and nobody was dead, which was, as these things went about, as much as you could hope for. He found Evelyn sitting on the fence rail near where they had tied the horses, wrapped in a blanket someone had brought her. She had stopped coughing. She was watching the smoke rise off the ruined east wall, with an expression that was thinking, not feeling the way she always looked when she was assembling information. He sat down on the fence beside her. "That fire started in the east corner," she said, "near the feed storage." "Yes, the feed storage doesn't have a lamp. You don't keep anything in there that produces heat." She paused. "I noticed that when I first came on because I reorganized the storage, and I thought about where the lamp should go and decided it shouldn't go in the corner." She looked at him. "That fire didn't start itself." He had been thinking the same thing since the moment he had seen where it began. "No," he said, "it didn't." "Boone," she said, "I can't prove that." "You don't have to prove it for me," she said. "I already know." She was quiet for a moment. "He's done this before, hasn't he? With other properties. He finds the leverage point, and he applies pressure until people make decisions they wouldn't otherwise make." "That's my read," Ezekiel said. "He thought the fire would frighten me," she said. "Or frighten you. He thought you'd tell me to go, or I'd decide to go, and then I'd be alone and exposed, and he'd have his opening." She pulled the blanket tighter. "He doesn't understand that burning something down is not the same as winning." Ezekiel looked at her. In the gray morning light with ash on her face, and her hair loose from whatever she'd had it pinned in, she looked nothing like the carefully contained young woman who had stood in her father's yard and said, "I am not property." She looked more real than that. She looked like someone who had been through fire literally and otherwise, and had come out the other side, holding on to what mattered and letting the rest burn. "We're going to Hale's today," he said. "Not tomorrow, today." She nodded. "Good." They were in the lawyer's office in Maricopa by 10 o'clock. Daisy left with a neighbor, Samuel, along because Ezekiel had decided his son needed to see this particular piece of business conducted. Aldous Hale was a thin, precise man in his 60s who had practiced law in Arizona since before it was a territory, and who had the manner of someone who had spent 50 years watching people do foolish things with property and was no longer surprised by any of it. He read the betrothal contract once. He set it down. He picked it up and read it again. He set it down a second time and looked at Evelyn over the top of his spectacles. "You never signed this," he said. "No." "You were not present when it was executed." "No." "And the property described in Schedule B of this agreement, the 40 acres deeded to your mother, you were unaware this was included." "I was unaware I owned it until yesterday," she said. "Mr. Callahan found the deed records." Hale looked at Ezekiel. "You pulled the county records." "Last night," Ezekiel said, "before the fire." Hale's eyes sharpened. "What fire?" Ezekiel told him. Hale listened without interrupting. And when Ezekiel was finished, Hale removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a cloth and put them back on, and the expression on his face was that of a man who has just seen something confirm a theory he had been developing for some time. "Boone has done this before," Hale said. "Not with fire necessarily, but the pattern, the leveraged contracts, the distressed sellers, the rail corridor land. I have seen this pattern 3 times in the past 2 years, and each time the people involved were in no position to fight back." He looked at Evelyn. "You are in a different position." "Because of the deed," she said. "Because of the deed, and because of what it reveals about the intent behind this contract. If Boone's attorneys included property in this agreement that they knew and they did know, Miss Harper, any competent land attorney, would have pulled the same records Mr. Callahan pulled that legally belonged not to your father, but to you. Then they did not make an error. They made a calculation." He tapped the document. "That is fraud, not civil fraud, criminal fraud." The word landed in the room and sat there. Samuel, who had been sitting in the corner chair trying to be invisible, stopped trying. He leaned forward. Evelyn did not move, but something in her shifted a charge like the air before a storm. "Can you prove it?" she asked. "I can build a case," Hale said carefully. "I need time, and I need access to the original deed documents, and I need any correspondence your mother may have left that references the property." He paused. "Did your mother keep records?" "Letters. Any personal documents?" Evelyn was very still. "Yes," she said slowly. She did. She was thinking about the wooden box. She was thinking about 20 years of letters sent to her mother's sister in Georgia, letters that had been returned to her after her mother died, letters she had carried out of that broken-down farmhouse in her arms because she had known without being able to say exactly why that they needed to be kept safe. She wrote to her sister every month for 20 years, Evelyn said, about everything. She looked at Hale. Would letters count as documentation? Hale looked at her. "That depends entirely on what the letters say," he said. "Do you have them with you?" "They're at the ranch," she said. She was already standing. "We can be back here in 3 hours." Hale checked his watch. He looked at Ezekiel. 3 hours, he said. 2.5, Evelyn said. They made it in 2 hours and 20 minutes. Evelyn had the wooden box in her lap the entire ride back to the ranch and the entire ride back to town, held in both hands, and she did not open it, and she did not speak, and Ezekiel did not try to make her do either. Samuel sat in the back of the wagon and watched the desert go by and said nothing at all, which was unusual enough that Ezekiel glanced back at him twice. The third time he looked back, Samuel was watching Evelyn with an expression that Ezekiel recognized because he had worn it himself at 14. The expression of a boy who has just seen someone demonstrate a kind of courage that reorders his understanding of what courage is supposed to look like. Hale opened the first letter and the second, and by the fifth he had gone very quiet in the specific way of a lawyer who has found what he was looking for. He set the letter down and looked at Evelyn across his desk, and he said in a voice that had lost its professional distance entirely, "Your mother knew." Evelyn leaned forward. "Knew what?" "She writes here this letter dated September of last year, 4 months before she died. She writes to her sister that a man named Boone came to the farm to make an offer on the property. She writes that she refused him. She writes..." He paused, looked down at the letter, looked back up. "She writes that Boone told her the land would be worth considerably more once the railway was confirmed, and that she should consider carefully before refusing. And she writes back to her sister that she refused anyway because she had planted apple trees on that land and she intended her daughter to have them." The room was silent. Evelyn's hand was over her mouth. "She knew he'd come back," Hale said quietly. "She writes it right here. She says, 'I do not think this man will take no for an answer, and I am afraid of what he will do when I am not here to give it.'" He set the letter down carefully. "She was protecting you. She was trying to protect you even from 4 months away from her own death." The sound that came from Evelyn was very small and very private. The sound of something that has been held in a long time finally finding the crack it needed. She pressed her hand harder against her mouth. She did not let it become more than that. She sat in the chair across from Aldous Hale's desk in Maricopa, with her mother's letter 3 feet away from her, and she did not come apart, because Evelyn Harper had been not coming apart for a long time, and she was very practiced at it. But her eyes were wet, and she did not bother to pretend they weren't. Ezekiel looked at his son. Samuel was looking at the floor. His jaw was set in a way that Ezekiel understood completely. "All right," Hale said gently, but with purpose, because he was a lawyer, and purpose was how he expressed care. "Here is what we are going to do." What Aldous Hale intended to do was file an emergency motion challenging the validity of the betrothal contract on the grounds of fraud in the inducement, misrepresentation of property rights, and failure of proper consent, and he intended to file it the following morning before Boone's attorneys had any opportunity to move first. "Speed matters in this," he told them, already pulling paper toward him across the desk. "Boone has resources, and he has contacts in this courthouse. Every day we wait is a day he has to file something of his own, or to find a judge who owes him a favor, or to do something else that makes our job harder." He looked up. "I'll work through the night if I have to. I need to retain those letters." Evelyn's hand tightened on the wooden box. Just for a moment. Then she opened it, removed the specific letters Hale had marked, and set them on his desk with the deliberate care of someone handing over something that cannot be replaced. "Those come back to me when this is finished," she said. "Every one of them," Hale said. "You have my word." They rode back to the ranch in the early dark, and nobody talked much, and when they arrived, Daisy ran out to meet them and grabbed Evelyn's hand and held it all the way into the house, and Evelyn let her and did not say anything about it. That night, Ezekiel sat on the porch after the children were in bed, and he heard the bunkhouse door open and close, and Evelyn's footsteps crossed the yard, and she sat down on the step below him without asking whether she was welcome. She had the wooden box in her lap. She was turning it slowly in her hands. "She knew he'd come back," Evelyn said. "Not to him exactly, more to the dark." She wrote it down in a letter to her sister because she had no one else to tell it to, and she didn't say a word to me because she didn't want me to be frightened. She paused. Or because she thought she had more time. Ezekiel said nothing. There was nothing useful to say, and he had enough respect for her not to fill the silence with something useless. "I've been angry at her," Evelyn said, "for dying. I know how that sounds." "It sounds like grief," he said. "That's all it sounds like." She was quiet again. A long quiet. An owl called somewhere out in the dark. "Why are you helping me?" she said. "And don't say because it's the right thing. I know it's the right thing. I'm asking why you personally are willing to take on a man like Boone for a woman you've known less than 2 weeks." He thought about it. He gave it the same honest weight he tried to give every question worth answering. "Because my daughter was in that barn," he said finally. "And you went in after her." She looked up at him. "Before that," he said, "because you reminded me of something I'd started to forget. That the measure of a situation isn't what's convenient, it's what's true." He paused. "Margaret used to say that. I'd been forgetting it." Evelyn looked at him for a moment in the dark. Then she looked back at the box in her hands. "She sounds like she was a formidable woman," she said. "She would have liked you enormously," he said. "She had no patience for people who wouldn't stand up for themselves, and she had infinite patience for people who would." The hearing was set for 10 days out, which was both faster than Ezekiel had expected and slower than he could easily tolerate. Because in those 10 days, Silas Boone was not idle. Nobody with Boone's resources was ever idle when he had something to lose. The first move came 4 days after Hale filed the motion. A man arrived at the ranch, not Boone himself, but a man in Boone's employ, the kind of man whose profession was communicating things that couldn't be put in writing. He said his name was Pruitt. He had the look of someone who had spent a career in the specific business of making things go away quietly. Ezekiel met him at the gate. "Mr. Callahan," Pruitt said. "Mr. Boone would like to make an offer." "Mr. Boone can make it through Aldous Hale's office," Ezekiel said. "This is the kind of offer that's better made informally," Pruitt said. He was pleasant about it the way a blade is pleasant before you understand what it is. Mr. Boone is prepared to withdraw the betrothal contract entirely. No contest, no counterfiling. The whole matter goes away. He paused. In exchange for a quiet deed transfer of the Harper land. Miss Harper retains her wages and her employment here and her good name. Mr. Boone retains the property. Everyone goes home. And the fire, Ezekiel said. Pruitt's expression did not change. I'm afraid I don't know anything about a fire, Mr. Callahan. No, Ezekiel said. I didn't imagine you would. He looked at the man steadily. Tell Boone the answer is no. Tell him the next communication I want from him is through the court. Pruitt looked at him for a moment. Mr. Callahan, he said carefully. Mr. Boone is a patient man when it suits him, and a considerably less patient one when it doesn't. I would encourage you to think about your children. The air between them changed. Ezekiel took one step forward, just one, and he said very quietly, If you ever reference my children again in any context in connection with this matter, I will ensure that Aldous Hale adds your name to the filing. Is that understood? Pruitt understood. He left. Ezekiel went inside and did not tell Evelyn about the last part of that conversation because she would have blamed herself, and there was nothing in the situation that was her fault. He told her about the offer. She was at the kitchen table going through his ledgers, which she had taken over entirely, at this point her handwriting running in neat columns beside his rougher hand. She looked up when he sat down across from her. She listened to everything he said without interrupting. When he was finished, she said, He's frightened. Yes, Ezekiel said. Men like Boone don't make retreat offers unless they've looked at what's coming and decided they'd rather lose a little than risk losing everything. She set down her pen. What does Hale think our chances are in court? He said good, not guaranteed. Good is enough, she said. We go to court. The night before the hearing, Walter Harper appeared. He arrived on foot, which told Ezekiel the man had sold his horse since the last time he'd seen him, and he arrived after dark, which told Ezekiel he had not wanted to be seen coming. He stood at the gate and called out, and Ezekiel went out to meet him with a lamp. Harper looked diminished. That was the word that came to mind, as if something structural had gone out of him, some internal scaffolding that had been holding him in the approximate shape of a man. He was thinner. His hands were not steady. I need to talk to my daughter, he said. That's her choice, not mine, Ezekiel said. He went back inside and relayed the message to Evelyn, without any of his own opinion attached to it, because it was not his opinion that mattered. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'll talk to him. She went out. Ezekiel stayed inside and did not listen because she had not asked him to listen. But Samuel was at the window, and after a few minutes he turned away from it with a complicated expression that Ezekiel recognized as the look of a young person confronting the fact that adults are capable of being both terrible and human at the same time, with no contradiction between the two. Evelyn was outside for 20 minutes. When she came back in, she went straight to the table and sat down and poured herself a cup of coffee and held it in both hands without drinking it. He didn't know about the land, she said. Or he says he didn't. Do you believe him? She thought about it honestly the way she thought about everything. I believe he didn't know what it was worth, she said. I believe Boone told him the land was just land, and that the arrangement was about his debts, not about a railroad. I believe he is genuinely capable of having signed his daughter's name into a legal contract without understanding what he was signing away, because he has spent a great deal of his life not understanding things he should have understood. She paused. That doesn't make it forgivable. It just makes it pathetic instead of calculated. Is he coming to the hearing? She looked at her coffee cup. He says he'll testify, she said quietly. He says he'll tell the judge he didn't understand what he was signing, that Boone's man told him it was a standard labor agreement. She paused. I don't know if it's true, but he's going to say it. Something shifted in the shape of the case. Ezekiel could feel it even from a distance from the law, the way a certain kind of peace falls into place. He sent a message to Hale that night. The courthouse in Maricopa was a plain building that smelled of wood and old paper, and the specific anxiety of people who had come to it with things they needed resolved. The hearing room filled faster than Ezekiel expected. News traveled in small counties the way water traveled in dry ground, finding every crack, and by the time the judge took his seat, there were people standing along the back wall. Judge Elias Croft was a man of 60, with a face like weathered stone, and eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that have seen most things, and are not easily disturbed. He looked at the room and at the parties assembled before him, and he said, "This is a hearing on a motion to invalidate a betrothal contract. We will conduct this in an orderly fashion. I have read the filings. I have questions." He looked at Boone's attorney, a man named Garvey, who had come from Tucson and who wore his suit with the confidence of someone billing by the hour. "Mr. Garvey, explain to me how a betrothal contract comes to include property that the signing party did not legally own." Garvey stood. He was smooth, professionally smooth, the kind of smooth that comes from having talked its way out of difficult rooms before. "Your Honor, the property in question was included as collateral against the obligations described in the agreement. Mr. Harper represented himself as the owner of that property, and my client acted in good faith on that representation." "Your client acted in good faith," Croft repeated. He looked at Hale. "Mr. Hale." Hale stood. He was not smooth. He was precise, which was better. "Your Honor, we have documentation demonstrating that the property described in Schedule B of this contract was deeded to Eleanor Harper née Morgan in 1861, and that upon her death earlier this year, the property transferred by right of inheritance to her daughter, Miss Evelyn Harper, the named party of the second part in this agreement. We further have in evidence correspondence from the deceased Mrs. Harper indicating that a representative of Mr. Boone approached her directly to discuss the purchase of this specific property prior to her death, and that she refused that offer." He paused. "Mr. Boone did not act in good faith on a misrepresentation, Your Honor. He acted with advanced knowledge that the property belonged not to Walter Harper, but to the woman he was contracting to marry." The room shifted. Ezekiel felt it, the specific change in a room's air when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Garvey was on his feet. "Objection to the characterization." "Sit down, Mr. Garvey," Judge Croft said without heat. He looked at the letters Hale had submitted. He read from them in silence for a long moment. Then he looked at Boone, who was seated at the table to the right with his hands folded and his face controlled. "Mr. Boone," Croft said, "did you or did you not approach Eleanor Harper regarding the purchase of her property prior to her death?" Boone's attorney started to stand. Croft stopped him with a look. "Mr. Boone, not your lawyer, you." Boone looked at the judge. He looked at Evelyn. She was seated beside Hale, straight-backed, her hands folded on the table, her eyes on Boone's face with an expression that was entirely steady and entirely pitiless. He looked away from her. "I made an inquiry," he said, "as I do with many properties in the county. It was routine business." "And when she refused you," Croft said, "you subsequently entered into a contract with her husband that included that same property. Mr. Harper represented Mr. Boone." Croft's voice had not changed in volume or temperature, but something in it had solidified. "I am going to ask you one more time, and I want a direct answer. When you had this contract drawn up, when your attorneys drafted this document, did you know that the property in Schedule B belonged not to Walter Harper, but to his daughter?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. Ezekiel counted them. "I believe the matter was legally complex," Boone said carefully, "and that the contract represented a reasonable resolution of that complexity. It was not a yes. It was not a no. It was the answer of a man who had been in rooms like this before and knew how to navigate them. And it was Ezekiel thought exactly the wrong answer to give to a judge like Elias Croft. Croft looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at his papers. "Call Walter Harper," he said. Harper came forward from the back of the room, looking like a man walking to his own reckoning. He stood at the front of the room, and Hale asked him about the day he signed the contract, and he answered in a voice that was not steady but was audible. And what he said was this: Boone's man, not Boone himself, but Pruitt, had come to him a week after Eleanor's funeral, had told him the document was a labor agreement, a standard arrangement between Harper's daughter and Boone's household, had told him the property provision was just collateral notation standard, language didn't mean anything real, had told him to sign, and his debts would be settled. "And you signed," Hale said. "I signed," Harper said. He did not look at Evelyn. "I should not have signed. I know that. I was—" He stopped. "I was not in a right state. I should have read it. I should have—" He stopped again. His voice had gone rough. "I should have done a great many things different." Hale let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Mr. Harper." Harper turned to go back to his seat, and he stopped, and he looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. The distance between them was not just the width of the room. It was every word unsaid, and every choice already made, and everything that could not be undone. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked away, and he went and sat down. Judge Croft reviewed his notes. He reviewed the letters. He reviewed the contract. He was quiet for long enough that the room became uncomfortable with waiting, and then he spoke. "The betrothal contract submitted as evidence in this matter is invalid," he said, "on 3 grounds. First, the named party of the second part. Miss Evelyn Harper did not consent to, was not present for, and had no knowledge of the agreement at the time of execution. Second, the property described in Schedule B was not legally the property of the signing party. Walter Harper, and its inclusion in this agreement, constitutes a material misrepresentation regardless of intent. Third." He paused, and in the pause, something happened to Boone's posture. Something small and almost invisible, a bracing against what was coming. Third, the evidence presented strongly suggests that the party of the first part, Silas Boone, had prior knowledge that the property belonged to Miss Harper, and not to her father, and proceeded with the contract anyway. This court finds that this document was executed in bad faith, and it is accordingly void in its entirety. He set his pen down. "Furthermore," he said, "I am referring the matter of the arson of the Callahan barn and the conduct of one individual identified in testimony as Pruitt to the county sheriff for investigation. Mr. Boone, I strongly suggest you speak with your attorney before you leave this building today." He stood. The room stood with him, and it was over. Not everything Evelyn knew better than to think a judge's ruling erased everything. Boone still had money, and Boone still had lawyers, and Boone would find another way, or try to. The apple trees on her mother's 40 acres were still standing in dry ground, and the barn at the Callahan Ranch was still a ruin of charred timber. The wooden box in her hands still held the letters of a woman who had been afraid for her daughter and had not had enough time. But the contract was void. She was legally free. And in the courthouse hallway, when she walked out into the late afternoon sun with Hale on one side and Ezekiel on the other, and Samuel behind them, what she felt was not triumph exactly. It was something quieter and more solid. It was the feeling of standing on ground that was hers, and knowing that nobody had given it to her. She had taken it back. Silas Boone did not go quietly. Men like Boone never did. The judge's ruling had cost him the contract, and cost him the land, and cost him something harder to quantify: the particular kind of authority that comes from never having been told no in a courtroom which, once lost, does not fully return. But he still had money, and money in Arizona territory. In 1883 was its own kind of law, and he used what he had left of both to make the weeks following the hearing as difficult as possible. He filed a counter-motion challenging the evidentiary validity of Eleanor Harper's letters. Hale shot it down in 6 days. He filed a separate claim against Walter Harper for breach of the original agreement, which had nothing to do with Evelyn, but which was designed to destabilize everything connected to her name. Hale addressed that too, and the claim was reduced to a civil matter between Harper and Boone that would take years to resolve and had no bearing on Evelyn's freedom or her land. He sent Pruitt to the Callahan Ranch one more time. Ezekiel met him at the gate the same way he had the first time. Except this time, Samuel was standing beside him, and Samuel was holding a rifle with the relaxed competence of a boy raised on a working ranch, and Pruitt looked at the boy and then at Ezekiel and said, "Mr. Boone would like to discuss a financial settlement." "Pruitt," Ezekiel said, "the sheriff has your name in a file right now. I suggest you go home." Pruitt went home. Boone made one final attempt, and it was the most dangerous one because it was the quietest. He contacted the Territorial Railway Office and filed a competing land claim on the 40 Harper acres, arguing that the original deed to Eleanor Harper's father contained a surveying error that invalidated the boundary line. It was a technical argument thin as paper, but thin arguments in the hands of well-paid lawyers had a way of becoming substantial problems over time. It was Evelyn who dismantled it. She had been studying the land survey records since the day Ezekiel first showed them to her, because that was what Evelyn Harper did. She found the thing that needed understanding, and she understood it completely down to its foundation. She had written to her mother's sister in Georgia, who still had documents from her grandfather's original land grant documents that predated the surveying error argument by 30 years, and which contained the precise boundary measurements that made Boone's claim mathematically impossible. She brought the documentation to Hale herself. She had done the calculations herself. She walked him through the numbers, the same way she had walked Ezekiel through the feed supplier discrepancy, clearly, specifically, with no room for misunderstanding. Hale read what she had put in front of him. He read it twice. He looked up at her. "Did you do this analysis on your own?" "Yes," she said. "In how long?" "4 evenings," she said. "The geometry isn't complicated once you understand what you're looking at." The original surveyor used natural landmarks as anchor points. The landmarks are still there. Boone's claim requires the landmarks to have moved, which landmarks don't do. Hale sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize in the past weeks. The expression of a man recalibrating something. "Miss Harper," he said, "have you ever considered reading for the law?" She blinked. "Women can't practice law in Arizona territory." "Not yet," he said. "But the argument being made in several eastern states right now is that they should be able to. And regardless of what's permitted currently, a woman who can dismantle a fraudulent land claim using geometry and 30-year-old documents is not a woman who should be keeping household accounts for the rest of her life." He paused. "Think about it." She thought about it all the way back to the ranch, sitting in the wagon beside Ezekiel with the late afternoon sun on her face, turning the idea over the way she turned everything over, looking at it from all sides, testing its weight, checking for the clause that changed everything. "Hale thinks I should read for the law," she said. Ezekiel was quiet for a moment. "What do you think?" "I think it's impossible in several practical ways," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. He was watching the road, hands easy on the reins, the same way he always was, unhurried, attentive, taking up exactly the space he needed, and no more. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would be very good at it." "You would be extraordinary at it," he said. "And the practical problems are problems for tomorrow. Today, just let yourself have the thought." She looked at the road ahead of them. She let herself have the thought. It was larger than she had expected and warmer, and it had the particular quality of thoughts that fit that slot into some interior space that has been waiting for exactly that shape without knowing what it was waiting for. "My mother would have liked that," she said, "enormously." "I know," he said. "She planted the apple trees for you. I think she planted a few other things too." Evelyn did not answer, but she did not look away from the road for a long time, and the expression on her face was one that had not been there on the day he first saw her open, forward-facing, the expression of a person who has begun to believe in the length of her own future. Boone's railway claim was dismissed the following month. The sheriff's investigation into the barn fire reached a conclusion that named Pruitt as the responsible party. Pruitt, faced with the specific arithmetic of his situation, agreed to provide testimony about the instructions he had received, and that testimony, delivered in exchange for reduced charges, was enough to ensure that Silas Boone spent the following 2 years in a great deal of expensive legal difficulty that kept him occupied and kept him far from the Harper land and far from the Callahan ranch. He never came back. The barn was rebuilt in October. The whole community came for it the way communities did in those years, when a neighbor lost something, people arriving with tools and lumber and food, working through 2 days and filling the yard with the noise of hammering and children and the particular warm chaos of collective effort. Evelyn stood in the middle of it and handed up boards and passed water and organized the food table with the same efficient calm she brought to everything. And Samuel worked beside grown men without anyone feeling the need to point it out, and Daisy ran between everyone's legs until she was given a small hammer and a pile of scrap wood to practice on, which kept her constructively occupied and only moderately dangerous. At the end of the second day, when the barn stood solid and new, and the last of the neighbors had driven home in their wagons, Ezekiel sat on the fence rail and looked at what had been built and felt something loosen in him that had been tight for 4 years. Margaret had loved barn raisings. She had said they were the best evidence she knew of that people were fundamentally decent underneath all the other things they were. He thought about telling Evelyn that, and then he thought that she probably already knew it. She came and sat beside him on the fence the way she had that first night when everything was uncertain and smoke was still rising from the ruin. She was tired, genuinely. Physically tired, the honest tiredness of real work, which was different from the exhausted weariness she had carried with her from her father's farm. Her hair had come loose and she hadn't bothered to fix it. She had sawdust on her sleeve. "Good barn," she said. "Good barn," he agreed. They sat for a moment in the easy silence that had become the natural register of their time together. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have enough of each other's company that words are optional. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "You're always thinking." "I've been thinking about the 40 acres. She looked down at her hands. "I want to plant something on it, beyond the apple trees. I want to start using it properly." A pause. "I'd need help with the clearing, and I'd need to know more about water rights in that section, because the creek that runs through the east boundary, I'm not certain who holds the water claim." "I can look into the water claim," he said. "I know you can," she said. "That's why I'm telling you instead of figuring it out myself." He looked at her. She was looking at her hands. There was something in the way she said it, the deliberate choosing of his help over her own considerable capability, that was not a small thing, and they both knew it. "Evelyn," he said. "I know," she said, still looking at her hands. "I know what you're going to say." "You don't," he said. "Because I haven't said it yet." She looked up at him. He met her eyes directly the way he did everything without performance, without hedging with the full weight of what he meant behind it. "I'm not going to pretend I haven't noticed," he said. "Because I have, and because pretending otherwise seems like a waste of both our time, and I don't have the patience for it at this point in my life." He paused. "You are the most capable, most honest, most genuinely formidable person I have had in my life since Margaret died. And I have no interest in you leaving this ranch when your contract runs out. I have interest in finding out whether what I think is between us is what I think it is." Another pause shorter. "That's what I was going to say." She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look without flinching because he had nothing to flinch from. "That's a very lawyerly declaration," she said. "I spent a lot of time around Hale recently," he said. The sound she made was a laugh, a real one, full and unguarded, the kind that arrived without permission, and didn't apologize for it. He had heard her laugh exactly 3 times before this, and had found himself thinking about all 3 of them later, which told him everything he needed to know about the situation. "I'm not the same person I was 2 months ago," she said when the laugh had settled. "I need you to know that. I don't mean that as a warning. I mean it as I'm still figuring out what I am when nobody is trying to own me, and I don't entirely know yet what that looks like." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to have it figured out." "You have children?" she said. "They have to be part of this, or it isn't real." "Daisy cried when she thought you might leave after the hearing," he said. "And Samuel quoted something you taught him in a conversation with a grown man last week, and he quoted it correctly and with confidence." He paused. "I think the children have made their position clear." She looked at the new barn. She looked at the yard, at the last of the light falling gold across the dry ground, at the house where she had spent 2 months learning what it felt like to be somewhere safe. She looked at the bunkhouse which had been hers, which had been the first room she had ever occupied, that no one had the right to take from her. Then she looked at him. "All right," she said, quietly, and with the complete conviction of a woman who did not say things she did not mean. "All right." He did not reach for her hand. She reached for his. A deliberate choice, her fingers closing over his, with the same purposeful certainty she brought to contracts and ledgers and geometric calculations. She held on. He held on. They sat on the fence rail in the last of the October light and said nothing else, because nothing else was needed. Winter came early that year and left late, the way Arizona winters sometimes did. And by spring, the 40 acres had a plan, and the plan had a start, and the creek boundary had been resolved in Evelyn's favor through a claim Hale filed in November that nobody contested. Samuel was reading civil law alongside his arithmetic because he had decided he wanted to understand how the world was organized before he inherited his portion of it, and because Evelyn had told him with characteristic directness that a man who understood the law was a man who was very difficult to cheat. Daisy could read anything put in front of her, and was working through a primer on natural science that Evelyn had ordered from a bookseller in Tucson, and she had opinions about geology that she expressed at length during supper. The apple trees on the 40 acres bloomed that April for the first time in 3 years, white and extravagant against the blue Arizona sky, the way Eleanor Harper had planted them to bloom. Patient, persistent, indifferent to everything that had been done around them, and to them rooted so deep in the ground that no amount of neglect or malice or grief had been able to kill them. Evelyn stood among them one morning in the early light, before the house was awake, before the day had made any demands, and she pressed her hand against the bark of the oldest tree, the one her mother had planted first, the one that had been 11 years growing before it bore a single fruit, and she stood there for a long time with her eyes closed and her hand on the rough bark, the way a person stands at a graveside or a threshold in the space between what was and what is. She was not property. She had never been property. She was a woman who could read a land survey and dismantle a fraudulent legal claim, and teach a 9-year-old to love books and walk into a burning barn and come out holding what mattered. And she was standing on her mother's land in the light of a spring morning that belonged to no one and to everyone, and she was choosing, had chosen, would keep choosing what her life was, and who she shared it with, and what she planted in the ground for the people who would come after. That was the whole of it. That was the only freedom worth having. Not the kind someone grants you, not the kind a judge's ruling hands you, but the kind that lives in the choosing itself, in the daily undefeated act of standing in your own ground and refusing to be moved. Evelyn Harper opened her eyes. The apple trees were blooming all around her, white as conviction, steady as stone. She had planted nothing yet, and already she could see the harvest coming.